When Candy Cadet first appeared in Pizzeria Simulator, the stories it told were quickly noted as connected to the story of Five Nights at Freddy's overall, which made the animatronics' later appearances and stories in Ruin and Help Wanted 2 immediately stand out. However, while certain interpretations of Candy Cadet's stories are widely believed, not only do I think important aspects of them have been largely overlooked, but also that the main messages of most of Candy Cadet's stories and the important lore insight they give have been almost entirely misinterpreted and put aside. The Candy Cadet stories have a pretty distinct split between the ones in Pizzeria Simulator and the ones after, with a common theory being that each of Candy Cadet's original stories are all about the same event. Because of this, I'm going to tackle the Pizzeria Simulator stories as a group and then move on to the new ones. For those who have seen my original Candy Cadet video, you'll likely notice some similarities between the Pizza Sim portion of this video and the original, but I do have some new thoughts about them that I didn't cover originally, so sticking around for those parts of the video should still hopefully be interesting. But before I get into that, you may have noticed a special addition to my desk today, and while I am about a week late to verbally announcing it in a video because life decided to kick me in the shins, I'm excited to announce the launch of the Ghost ID or Ghosty plush. Ghosty may look sad, but that just means she'll be able to sympathize with you when the theorizing makes you too want to cry. And since she glows in the dark, she'll be able to haunt you in a friendly way, even when the lights are out. She's only available till December 19th though, and will only get produced if at least 200 plushies sell. So if you want a Ghosty of your own, there's a link at the top of the description and in the pinned comment. Either way, I really appreciate everyone's support in whatever way that manifests, and I hope you enjoy the video. So what are the original Candy Cadet stories about? On a surface level, the stories are pretty simple, if a bit strange. One story is about a young woman sealed in a room with 5 keys and a furnace. The 5 keys could each unlock a different door outside her room that had a child trapped behind each, but she was only allowed to take 1 key out of the room. The woman used the furnace to melt the keys together so she could take all of them, but all that did was make it so rather than being able to save 1 life, she could save none. Another is about a boy with a hungry snake who found a box of 5 kittens. Despite knowing the snake might eat them, he didn't want to get rid of the snake, and while he knew that if he fed a kitten to the snake it might be satisfied, he couldn't choose which one and left the snake's cage open when he went to bed. The snake ate a kitten, but after 5 nights the boy felt regret, so he cut the snake open, put the remains of the kitten back together, and then put the kitten back in the box. The final story stars a man who would visit and bring happiness to 5 orphans, but feared what would happen if a burglar broke into their homes, so he adopted them. He came home one day to find that a burglar had broken into his home and killed all 5. Because he couldn't afford more than 1 coffin, he sewed the bodies together and buried them, with the story ending by saying there was a knock at the door. Immediately, it's pretty easy to see why many people connect all these stories to being about the same event. What with how many times 5 things and stuff getting combined into one comes up in every story. The usual interpretation I see is that they're about a theory called Molten MCI, where William Afton combines the remnant of the original 5 missing children to create or put into the Funtime animatronics in Sister Location, which would later combine to become Ennard and kick Circus Baby out to become Molten Freddy. 5 things become 1, 5 dead kids haunt 1 pile of robot spaghetti. However, there are a few reasons I don't think that's what these stories are about. For one thing, only 2 of the stories are actually about 5 things becoming 1. The story about the young woman with the keys specifies she melted the 5 keys together to create a single one, and the story about the man specifies he stitched the 5 children's bodies together. But the story about the boy, snake, and kittens only ever mentions 1 kitten being eaten despite the existence of 5. Sure, 5 nights go by, but the story only ever mentions the 1, and even specifies that the boy thought 1 kitten could satisfy the snake, which would check out given real life snakes canonically don't eat much. The only place that says 5 kittens were eaten is the Ultimate Guidebook, which also says a lot of things that are just flat out false, such as that Sister Location takes place at Circus Baby's Pizza World, not entertainment and rentals. So it isn't a particularly reliable source of information. And honestly, if the stories were meant to be about William combining the spirits into one form, it would be pretty strange for each of the characters doing the combining to be so different from each other and from William himself. The woman was actively trying to save children while William killed them. The boy felt regret for letting the snake eat a kitten due to his unwillingness to stop it, while William doesn't seem to have regret for killing the missing kids at all. Though there are some cases where I could see William being the boy if the subject isn't the missing kids. Finally, not only did the man who stitched the bodies together actually care about the safety of the kids who died, he wasn't the one to kill them. There's an entirely separate burglar character that kills the 5 kids, much like William does in the actual lore. That isn't to say that none of them could possibly be about or include the Molten MCI theory, but all 3 of them being about that, or honestly even the same topic at all, seems unlikely given just how different the stories are. In fact, I think there are explanations for each of these stories that fit the characters and contents much better. So what are these stories really about if it's not just the same instance of 5 things becoming 1? Well, Pizzeria Simulator as a game was meant to tie up loose ends and give explanations for the story up to that point. It showed us how Charlie Emily came to possess the puppet even though she died outside the restaurant, and how William lured one of his victims. While some of the information we're given is less understood than others, shout out to Midnight Motorist, the lore we get in Pizzeria Simulator is all about filling in some of the gaps to wrap up that arc of the story. And I think that the Candy Cadet stories are similar, with each of them giving insight into different characters and events from the series in the lead up to Pizzeria Simulator. For example, I think the key story is most likely about Charlie Emily and her efforts to help William's other victims in FNAF 2's Give Gifts, Give Life minigame, and how that led to the spirits being around for Pizzeria Simulator. After all, the young woman in the story was sealed in a room, just like Charlie's spirit was sealed in the puppet. And just like there were 5 kids trapped in their own rooms, there were 5 kids killed by William Afton, just like Charlie was. And just like the woman wanted to save all of the children by melting the keys to their freedom together, leaving them all trapped instead, Charlie tried to help them in Give Gifts, Give Life, but all of their souls remained trapped for decades despite of, or because of, her efforts. This is where in my original video I explained that this story gives additional insight into Charlie's efforts to help the kids, because the woman in the story apparently could have saved one of the trapped children, but because she melted the keys together, she wasn't able to. I suggested that this could mean Charlie may have been able to use her remnant to bring one of the kids back from the dead, as that is a thing Remnant can do. We see it happen with Michael Afton, where he comes back as a zombie, but is also implied to have potentially recovered in the scrapped Fazbear Fright story You're the Band, where there's a Freddy's security guard named Mike who knows a lot about hauntings and Freddy's, but also apparently looks like a college kid in the year 2015. Maybe Charlie could have literally given life back to one of the children who were killed, but by trying to use her remnant to save all of them, they may have been anchored more fully to the realm of the living but remained trapped. However, I've somewhat rethought my position on this. I still do think that this general concept could be what the story is trying to imply, but I don't think Charlie was necessarily using her own power in order to make things work. The merged fates of the children via the merged keys of the story reminds me of Happiest Day, where only once all of the pieces of Happiest Day and the spirits are gathered can the spirits be released. And the culminating event of that is giving cake to a spirit in Golden Freddy. There's a relatively popular theory that the crying child's remnant ended up split between all of the animatronics. And while I think he does primarily possess Golden Freddy, the fact that all of the spirits need to be gathered in the Happiest Day ending for the spirits to move on seems to imply their fates are tied together, just like in the Candy Cadet story. As such, I think it's entirely possible that Charlie wouldn't have used her own remnant to try and heal the missing kids. She instead used the crying child's remnant or memories. But rather than healing or freeing any of them from their mechanical prisons, all she did was bind them together in death. Either way, I think it lines up pretty well with the narrative that we're given. As for the others, the Kitten Story is the one where I can most easily see the argument for its protagonist character representing William, especially since it seems to be a metaphorical retelling of the events surrounding Sister Location. A red snake chooses a kitten to eat while the boy turns a blind eye. Meanwhile, William Afton left Circus Baby, who has red as a very prominent color, to her own devices to choose a child to kill. It just so happened that said child was his daughter Elizabeth, which could then explain the boy's regret and decision to kill the snake and put the kitten back together and in the shoebox with the others, which could then metaphorically represent the combination of the Funtime animatronics into Ennard, as Circus Baby, Ballora, Funtime Foxy, Funtime Freddy, and Bonbon would amount to 5, just like there were 5 total kittens. However, there are a few details in this story that lead me to believe this story isn't actually about William, but rather his son Michael. After all, even if William was the one who told Mike to put his sister back together, the fact that the story says the boy was the one to do so himself, and that he specifically did so after 5 nights, stands out to me in the context of Mike being our player character in Sister Location. William isn't the one who spent 5 nights at Circus Babies, the one to claim the role of putting Elizabeth back together, or the one to play a direct role in the creation and escape of Ennard. Sure, he kickstarted the events, but Michael was the one to go through and do it. The boy in the story seems to not want the snake to eat any of the kittens, since the only thing keeping him from saving them was that he personally felt too attached to the snake. If the boy were William, why wouldn't he want the animatronic he built with child-grabbing capabilities to grab a child? That would be exactly what he built Circus Baby for, so it wouldn't be a matter of pain to consider getting rid of the snake, knowing it might do snake things. That being said, technically neither Mike nor William were the ones to directly remove Circus Baby's endoskeleton, so the boy cutting open the snake to get the kitten out doesn't necessarily match either of them in regards to Circus Baby. Because of this, I think the snake could potentially not just be a representation of Circus Baby, but also likely William, who was responsible for her creation. Michael clearly felt enough loyalty to his father to follow his instructions in Sister Location, even though the circumstances they put him in were definitely dangerous. So it seems likely to me that this story shows us Michael's arc in regards to his feelings about his father, and potentially implies that he may have had suspicions or some level of knowledge about what William was really up to. But while he initially turned a blind eye because he cared about his dad, he eventually had a change of heart, put his sister back together, and turned on his father, leading to him eventually being present in Pizzeria Simulator to assist in setting William Afton and his legacy ablaze. And this leads into the last of Candy Cadet's original stories, which I think make makes the most sense being about William's former business partner, Henry Emily, and what led him to eventually set up Pizzeria Simulator in the first place. The story being about a kind man who brought happiness to children would make a lot of sense considering Henry was one of the co-founders of Fredbear's and Freddy's, which brought joy to children, and the fact that the man lived alone could connect to the loss of his daughter Charlie. Now, regardless of whether or not you believe in the current lore that Charlie was the first of William's victims, as a Pizzeria Simulator that was almost certainly the case, since it wouldn't make much sense for Henry to claim being the first one wounded by William's murders if anyone else had died first. As such, the man being alone without his daughter as of the time of the missing children incident would make sense, at least in the context of Pizzeria Simulator. Whether or not she is still the first victim overall is a whole can of worms I'm going to save for a potential later video for the sake of getting this video out anywhere close to on time. Anyway, another reason it seems this story relates to Henry is because of a particular line in the story that's echoed in Henry's recording we hear during the game's Insanity ending. The story mentions a man brought the 5 children together in one place, and Henry in the Insanity ending says that in order to help William's victims find rest, he has to bring them all together in one place. The 5 children are almost certainly a parallel for the missing children and the burglar who killed them for William. As for the man stitching the bodies of the children together, I can see the argument being made that this would be indicative of the Molten MCI theory. However, I don't think that's necessarily what this story is meant to be about, and not just because it would be a bit strange for Henry to be the one to mix the soul juice of the MCI kids into Molten Freddy if that's what's going on with him. Molten Freddy and the other characters in Pizzeria Simulator are much better represented by the final line of the story, where after the stitched together child is buried, there's a knock at the door, which could metaphorically lead directly into the animatronics showing up in the back alley of the pizzeria for Michael to bring in. The thing is, regardless of how possessed or not Molten Freddy is by specifically the 5 missing kids, Molten Freddy's arrival at the pizzeria wouldn't necessarily account for the entirety of the children's souls. In the bad ending of FNAF 3, we can see that if the spirits don't move on, the heads of the original animatronics still have their eyes lit up, implying the continued presence of the spirits. Even if some of their remnant was harvested and put into the fun times in one way or another, it seems as though at least part of their souls remained in their original animatronics, which aligns well with how in the book The Fourth Closet, even after the kids' remnant is put into the funtime animatronics, they still maintain control over the classics. Additionally, Henry would have needed something to inspire his Insanity ending speech, which he starts by saying he only now understands just how depraved William really was, before mostly talking about what William did to the missing kids and their spirits after they died. To me, it seems like something related to the missing kids is what made Henry aware of the situation and inspired his plan, and I think the potential spiritual remnants present in FNAF 3 would be able to do just that. After all, in the final newspaper we get about the location burning down, we read that items were salvaged and sold at a public auction. Since the endings of the game show the intact heads of the animatronics, this seems to imply that they didn't burn down with the rest of the building. Who's to say that Henry didn't somehow find out about and get a hold of them? He could have done so, discovered they were haunted, and then come up with his plan for Pizzeria Simulator. He would have then brought them together to what would become their one metaphorical coffin before the knock at the door of the other animatronics arriving, just like the man in the story, with the stitching together of the bodies potentially representing the conditions being made right for the spirits to move on. As in the Key story, the keys to their freedom were combined into one as well. Of course, these are just my interpretations, and with how the stories are written, I can definitely see other things potentially being the case. So feel free to drop a comment with your own interpretations if you disagree, or consider subscribing if you do agree. Either way though, I find these interpretations to be particularly satisfying with how they give greater insight into the 3 characters that worked against William on behalf of his victims, all leading up to the culminating end of the game where we hear the stories told. But while that covers the original 3 stories, that's no longer where Candy Cadet stories end. Imagine my surprise when I came out with my Candy Cadet video last year, only for us to get a new story in Security Breach's Ruin DLC, and then again in Help Wanted 2. I wouldn't be surprised if the guy showed up with a new story in Secret of the Mimic at this point, and honestly I would not complain. Candy Cadet is great. Anyway, despite technically coming second in the timeline, Ruin's Candy Cadet story is the first one we're given, and fortunately its meaning seems pretty clear. A monster is locked in the basement by a boy's mother, and the mother reassures the boy that it wouldn't be able to escape and sings the boy to sleep. Unfortunately, the monster learned to copy the lullaby, and one day when the mom was gone, it sang the song, and hearing it, the boy opened the door. With the big reveal of Ruin being the Mimic endoskeleton sealed in the basement's basement of the Pizzeria Simulator location, having copied Gregory's voice to lure Cassie into freeing it, this story being given right before said reveal seems to be pretty straightforward foreshadowing. Could it be about something else? Technically it's possible. In the cases of the Pizzeria Simulator stories, each of the protagonist characters matched the gender of the character they seemed to correlate with Charlie being a young woman, Mike being a boy, and Henry being a man. Meanwhile, the character in Ruin's story that gets tricked into freeing the monster is a boy tricked by someone copying his mother's voice, while Cassie, who releases the Mimic in the game, is a girl, and the voice used to lure her is a boy's. As such, I could see an argument being made for the story potentially being about Vanessa as the mother and Gregory as the son or something, but that would be a lot of extrapolation that doesn't really have much to back it up besides the genders of the characters. So why have the characters' genders line up for the original stories but change change it up for this one. It could just be a way to differentiate the stories from their predecessors, or an arbitrary choice that doesn't mean anything. For all we know, this is technically a different Candy Cadet, what with the design differences and how the original Candy Cadet refers to itself as just Candy Cadet, but this one seems to say it's a Candy Cadet. Either way, I don't think the reason for the switch and gender correlation is as important as the fact that the switch was made. And that's mostly because I think it's relevant to understanding Candy Cadet in Help Wanted 2. Technically speaking, there are 2 Candy Cadet stories in Help Wanted 2, but one of the stories is just a generic thing about a family who didn't buy a special pizza deal and then died. So I'm pretty sure that story was a joking example of what the Candy Cadet stories would normally be at the restaurant, if not for whatever happened to alter them into the ones that are actually lore relevant via remnant memories or something along those lines. However, the other story we get is much more in line with the stories we got before in terms of its general vibe. This story is about a girl who was lured into a forest and almost eaten by a witch, but managed to escape with a permanent scar. When the girl grew up, she returned to the forest to get revenge on the witch, and a young boy offered to guide her. The boy brought her to a house and told her to rest there before killing the witch, and she followed him in. The story ends by saying, the oven door closed, the witch would finally have her meal. With how Ruin seems to be about Cassie's story up until the approximate point we're giving Candy Cadets, it seems likely to me that Help Wanted 2's story would be similar, giving us the story of our protagonist character, who I, as well as what I'm pretty sure is the majority of the community, believe to be Cassie's dad, a Fazbear Entertainment technician. I go into a lot more detail about this particular theory in my video about Help Wanted 2 if you're interested, but if this theory is the case, this would line up with the swapped genders of Ruin's Candy Cadet story. Additionally, the witch in the story is almost definitely a representative of Glitchtrap, given he's the main antagonistic force at play during Help Wanted 2. The final portion of the story seems to be the direct lead-up into the events of the game, where just as the woman is tricked into entering the oven of her own accord in her quest for revenge, Cassie's dad wound up in the dilapidated Pizzeria simulator location, where he ends up under the influence of the Vanny mask, accidentally helps Glitchtrap, and winds up passing off his own curse onto his daughter after possessing the mask bot we see at the beginning of Ruin. While I'm not 100% settled on who I think the boy in the story might be, I was talking to a fellow FNAF theorist _ the other day, who suggested that it could be the Helpy program, and I think he's onto something with that. After all, Helpy is integrated into the Vanny mask and seems to have a tendency to lead the individual wearing it to do things that aren't necessarily for their benefit if Ruin is any indication. Whenever Cassie's dad showed up and put on the Vanny mask to presumably get at Glitchtrap, the Helpy program very well could have been what brought him down to the abandoned pizzeria and orchestrated tricking him into helping Glitchtrap. However, that only accounts for the latter portion of Candy Cadet's story. The only reason the woman was there is because she wanted revenge on the witch for the scar the witch had given her as a child. If this story is about Cassie's dad, I don't think him theoretically being the Bonnie masked bully from FNAF 4 and seeing the crying child die would account for that, since the only people he'd logically be getting revenge on for that situation would be himself and his friends. That being said, due to the phrase "Remember Jeremy" being included in Help Wanted 2, it's possible that Jeremy is the name of Cassie's father. Why bring up Jeremy specifically if he's not relevant after all? And if that is the case, we have other candidates for the events of Cassie's father's past. For example, we play as a character named Jeremy Fitzgerald in FNAF 2, and it's a pretty common theory that he was a victim and survivor of the infamous Bite of 87, which could account for a scar given to him by an outside party and a history with Fazbear Entertainment. However, if Cassie's dad were to be the bite victim, which I have my doubts about given the FNAF 1 prequel book seems to imply the bite victim was unable to do anything, and that's backed up by the fact that in real life, losing your frontal lobe would apparently leave you mentally and physically paralyzed, it still wouldn't make much sense for him to be coming back for revenge on Glitchtrap in Help Wanted 2, as Glitchtrap didn't exist at the time and William wasn't the one who bit the guy. Fortunately, I think the actual answer is more straightforward than that. After all, we have a pretty limited list of characters who we know were once controlled by Glitchtrap, and given Tape Girl, Vanessa, and Gregory all wouldn't make sense to be Cassie's dad for various reasons, we're left with only one candidate who actually fits surprisingly well and just so happens to be named Jeremy. Jeremy was the original beta tester of Help Wanted and the one to first note the existence of Glitchtrap. Eventually, he was replaced by Tape Girl because he used a paper slicer on his face, leaving behind something that Tape Girl describes as looking like a Halloween mask on the floor, along with spilled ink that was probably blood. While most assume that Jeremy died from slicing his entire face off, someone had to file the lawsuit that Tape Girl mentions, so given the room she found the mask in had lights on so Tape Girl would have been able to see, it's unlikely that this was just the guy's entire face, since I don't think that would have been mistakable for a Halloween prop. I think it's more probable that it looked more like one of those plasticky kids' Halloween masks. My guess is it was something along the lines of the Vanny mask, since we find out in Ruin and see again in Help Wanted 2 that the masks implant chips in their wearers that interface with their brains. Jeremy may have used the slicer to remove the chip and escape Glitchtrap's related influence, which would almost certainly leave behind a permanent scar. Personally, I think Cassie's dad being Help Wanted's Jeremy works incredibly well in the context of Candy Cadet's story. It creates a connecting thread between the original Help Wanted, where, funnily enough, is the first time we see the phrase "Remember Jeremy," almost as though giving literal instructions for us to remember Jeremy because he would be important later, and its sequel. It also gives an explanation for what his his motives would be and why he would leave his daughter behind to try and get rid of Glitchtrap in the first place. Plus, it keeps the narrative of the current arc much more self-contained than it would be if his history was only in the pre-Help Wanted era of games. So all in all, I think the most satisfying explanations for Candy Cadet stories are the ones where each story gives us extra insight into different characters that are relevant to the games we find the stories in. But if you disagree, that's totally fine. Either way, thanks for watching, make sure to check the link in the description if you want a Ghosty plush, don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.